The boat on Lake Baikal. The wind whipped through the skyscraper canyons in the La Défense business district. There were those who marveled at the Grande Arche and at the assortment of high-rise office buildings scattered over hundreds of hectares. Then there were others who were less enamored by the sight. To them, the buildings looked as if they had been strewn haphazardly by some giant striding through the territory to the west of Paris, and the thousands of office workers scurrying about still failed to lend a human dimension to the place. Jean-Marc belonged to that latter group. The insurance company that he worked for had recently moved from its stately headquarters near the Champs-Élysées to the glass tower that he was now heading towards. He scowled as he hunched his shoulders, wrapped his muffler more tightly around his neck, and pressed his body against the relentless wind. He entered the building, slid his badge over the electronic reader, and rode the elevator to the 12th floor, midway to the top. His group's assistant was sitting outside the row of cubicles. "Good morning, Marie-Jeanne," he said as he leaned over, placed his arm on her shoulder, sliding his fingers downward to massage her breast. It took only a few seconds. It was his morning ritual. He knew that Marie-Jeanne wouldn't protest. She needed the job, and besides, it would be the same wherever she went. It wasn't his fault if her big tits were so inviting. He removed his coat and his muffler, booted up his computer to check the intranet, and saw that his boss had scheduled a meeting for later that morning. What now? One day I'm going to turn into a slideshow. His desk was empty, aside from a single photo. He and his wife Catherine were standing on the deck of their sailboat, a 40-foot schooner that was moored on Lake Baikal. The boat was their only extravagance. They had no car, rented one when it was needed, no children either. Catherine. Once upon a time, she had had nice breasts as well, but now they hung like elongated melons, and it seemed that gravity had taken over, pushing all her body fat down into her belly. He sighed and pretended to work until it was time for the meeting. Bad news. Downsizing. Jean-Marc's group was going to be replaced by a consulting firm in India. They would, of course, receive severance pay and unemployment benefits. Still, the money wouldn't last forever, and he'd need to find another job and not take too long to do it. At first, they had continued to live as before. They went to the theater, dined out, and went skiing in the winter. Gradually, they stopped seeing their friends, who had continued to ask if Jean-Marc had found a new position, the unspoken phrase being, "Still no job? How curious." Catherine had picked up some work as an independent consultant, but by the time she finished paying social charges and taxes, there was not much left. 2 years later, they sold the schooner on Lake Baikal. At about the same time, one of Catherine's uncles died. He had never married, and she inherited his farm, deep in the heart of Brittany. In the beginning, they had viewed the inheritance as yet another burden, a property to be maintained, taxes to be paid. But one day Jean-Marc was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Catherine loved to cook. She was preparing a bœuf en croûte. She had a dark brown apron wrapped around her torso. Jean-Marc thought she looked like a tree stump. "I've been thinking," she said. "What about?" "Mon nid." "Sorry? You know, my uncle's farm. Mon nid." "And? We can't afford to keep living here. I think we should move to the farm, start a new life there." "You must be joking." Catherine was brushing milk over the crust that surrounded the roast. "No, I'm serious. Think about it." Jean-Marc would remember their conversation every time he ate red meat, which was quite often. A year later, they had moved to Brittany. While Catherine cooked elaborate meals and tended to the garden, Jean-Marc explored the region. He traveled from one isolated village to another, visiting churches and ruins from earlier times. He had still not gotten over his bitterness at being treated as expendable. In an empty church, they were all empty except when Mass was being said. He sat on a pew, staring at the altar, still seething that it had all come to this. No apartment, no vacations, and most of all, no boat. A shaft of mid-afternoon sunlight fell on a pair of bronze candlesticks. He approached the altar and touched them. No alarm went off. He went outside, walked up the street to a small supermarket where he bought a bottle of cheap wine. "Would you mind putting that in a bag?" he asked the man behind the cash register. Outside, Jean-Marc threw the bottle of wine into a garbage bin, went back to the church, and without hesitating, put the candlesticks into the shopping bag. When he returned to Mornnais, he placed the candlesticks on the table. "Look what I found." "What do you mean, what you found?" "I mean, I found them sitting on an altar in a church, all alone. Now they'll have some company." Catherine stood with her hands on her hips. "So now you've added petty theft to your CV?" "Never mind. This is the first amusement I've had for a long time." Many villages would organize a flea market where people sold the objects that cluttered their attics and barns. Odd lots of glassware, incomplete dinner services, flatware, embroidered bed linens, children's toys, mirrors, chairs, tables, costume jewelry, hand-painted ceramics, posters, CDs. On the whole, nothing remarkable, but those in the know would arrive early as the vendors were setting up and buy objects that never made their way to the display tables, but instead were sold quietly from the open car trunks. Jean-Marc continued to visit the little country churches, and from time to time he'd come upon an object that needed a new home. It might be a crucifix, a silver chalice, or a bronze holy water bowl, as long as it was not too large and easily removed. He joined the small group who arrived at the flea markets in the early morning hours and departed before the market got underway. One cold gray morning, he just sold a small icon. He was wiping the mist from the windshield when he felt someone standing behind him. He turned to see a dark-haired man with sallow skin. He wore a tracksuit despite the chill air. "You do good business." Jean-Marc stepped back, but the man moved closer to him. "I've seen you at these markets. Maybe you need other things to sell? I can help you. We have many things in our attic." "Sorry, pal, I'm not interested." Jean-Marc got into his car. As he drove home, he thought about the man's offer. Visiting churches had started to get boring, but it was the only way to find things to sell. He knew that there were many secondary residences, vacant for most of the year, but breaking and entering was not a skill he possessed. But others did. He'd have to share the proceeds of the sale, but he could do so much more business if he had the merchandise. The next time he saw the man, and he knew there would be a next time, he'd give it a try. Spring. It was early morning, but the sky already light, the air softer now that winter was over. He leaned against the bar counter, nursing a Calvados. He'd taken a liking to the rich golden liquid. "I see you like Calvados," said a big man who stood next to him. "Can I offer you a drink?" "Sure, thanks." Jean-Marc could already feel the effects of the Calvados on his empty stomach, but the guy seemed so friendly, it would be rude to refuse. "Pretty nice stuff that you sold this morning." Jean-Marc nodded, sipped his drink, and waited. "I was wondering, if I tell you what I'm looking for, perhaps you could find it for me?" "I could try, but no promises. It depends on what people want to sell." "Yes, of course, I understand." The big man downed his drink. "Another round?" Jean-Marc pointed to his half-full glass. "No, I'm fine, thanks." The big man ordered another Calvados, but he seemed no worse for wear. There's a big house on the coast, just outside of Roscoff. It's called the Villa Maud. Do you know it? No? Well, you can find it, I'm sure. Anyway, they have a lovely pair of Tiffany lamps, and in case they wanted to sell them, I'd be interested. Here. He handed Jean-Marc a slip of paper with a phone number. You can call me to let me know. It had happened so quickly. Jean-Marc locked onto the big man's eyes as he took his card. The eyes were bloodshot, yet the man seemed sober, drunk and sober at the same time. The man was smiling, but Jean-Marc felt a pang of fear in his belly. What's your name? He asked. Bruno. And yours? Jean-Marc. Bruno extended a large mitt, patting Jean-Marc's shoulder with his free hand. Glad to meet you, Jean-Marc. I know we're going to work well together. Bruno placed a 20-euro bill on the counter and walked out of the bar. Jean-Marc watched as he got into a car parked out front. The driver said something to him, Bruno laughed, and the car pulled out into the street. At the end of the summer, Jean-Marc and Catherine sat at the long wooden dining room table, counting the proceeds of their business with Bruno. Jean-Marc no longer went to the flea markets. Bruno and his driver, the man's name was Tarek, would come to Nagourney to pick up the merchandise. The driver was surly but sober. Bruno, on the other hand, always smelled of alcohol, and yet he was sharp in his dealings with Jean-Marc. Jean-Marc thought of the houses that his team had visited. The owners were filthy rich, just like those with offices on the top floors of all the buildings at La Défense. Relieving them of some extra possessions was nothing more than a salutary redistribution of income. He sat on an old wooden chair on the sparse lawn in front of the house. The chair's green paint had faded. Flakes of dried paint curled on the chair's armrests. It was sunny, but the light had started to get paler in the afternoon, and there was already a chill in the air. Images crossed his mind. The windy day he learned that he was to be let go, the 200 CVs he had sent out, the 20 job interviews that had led nowhere. The woman in the employment office had told him that he needed to be flexible, to reinvent himself. He chuckled. He'd certainly done that. He'd gotten used to life in the countryside, and he found that he was good at negotiating with the thieves who worked for him. The only drawback was Bruno. The big man frightened him. He'd never raised his voice, never threatened him physically, yet Jean-Marc felt that his presence was menacing. Tarek, the driver, reminded him of the other thugs he dealt with, and he could handle that. But he needed Bruno, needed the big man to remain sober enough to keep buying stolen goods from him. If he did, then one day they would be able to buy another boat on Lake Baikal. As it turned out, that was a pretty big if.